What is this strange Roman device that has baffled archaeologists for centuries?
The Romans were meticulous administrators, but we don't have any written accounts about these objects.
Is a machine powered by blood-sucking leeches the original weather app?
It seemed possible. Mad ideas didn't seem so mad.
Do these ancient scrolls mark the locations of buried treasure?
By the time they did the complete tally, it was something like 200 tons of gold and silver, something worth billions of dollars today.
These are the most remarkable and mysterious objects on Earth. Hidden away in museums, laboratories, and storage rooms. Now, new research and technology can get under their skin like never before. We can rebuild them, pull them apart, and zoom in to reveal the unbelievable, the ancient, and the truly bizarre. These are the world's strangest things. This strange bronze artifact is one of the great mysteries of the Roman Empire, because we have no idea what it is.
We don't have any written accounts about these objects. When we don't have a clear place to put fantastic objects like these, we end up in a vast mire of speculation.
As nothing is known about it, archaeologists simply call it a Roman dodecahedron, after its 12 sides. It might be considered nothing more than a curiosity, if there was only one. But incredibly, 116 of these dodecahedrons have been found. No two are exactly alike. They vary in size from 1.5 inches to 4.5 inches.
A Roman dodecahedron takes that 12-sided shape and it adds little spheres to each of the sort of corners, and that means you can stand it up nice and easily. And also on the faces, there are holes, and these holes are circles, but they're different sizes on every one of those faces.
When the bronze was polished, it would have a sheen, it would sparkle in the sunlight, it would catch your eye.
There are no numbers, no writing, no other marks to explain what it is for. Now a theory has emerged. We may have been getting the purpose of the dodecahedrons wrong for centuries. So what is it really for? Where does it come from? What is this strange object? One thing we know for certain, Romans were obsessed with gambling.
It's a cuboid. It could be used for games. And the Romans loved their dice games. Everyone played them. And in the same way that we see people on the tube playing Candy Crush or a game on their telephone, when you excavate buildings in Rome, often major temples are riddled with game boards where people just sat and played dice. We have tons of archaeological evidence. In Pompeii, there's a famous wall painting that shows men fighting over a dice game. Caesar, before he crossed the Rubicon, is famous for saying, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, I'm throwing in my fate.
Romans used dice in endless combinations of shape and size to suit a multitude of games. So, is it a dice? Unfortunately, there are flaws to this theory.
You pick these things up and you try to throw them. Well, because they don't have a flat face, they don't bounce correctly, they don't land right, and they don't have numbers on them.
Magnifying it reveals that every hole is a different size, so the weight of each side is different, which makes it a loaded dice.
So the primary function of a die isn't really adhered to by these objects. So that's a bit of a problem.
Another suggestion is that it's a candle holder.
I understand where the idea came from, which is that some traces of wax have been found on the inside of one of these.
But this theory also has serious flaws.
It would be a candle holder that didn't really work very well in protecting your hands from getting burned or holding a very large candle. If you've ever used a candlestick, There's a grip and a long rim around the top of it to stop the wax dripping onto your hand.
It's even been suggested that it's a child's toy.
The idea that you'd give your child a small metal toy to play with, my son would have had it in his mouth, in his ear, he'd have probably tried to get it up his nose.
So not a dice, not a candle holder, and definitely not a toy. Is there a clue in the pattern of where these mysterious artifacts have been found? Every Roman dodecahedron discovered is in the north and northwest regions of the empire, where the weather is colder and generally less pleasant. None are found in the sunnier southern regions, which has led to a new theory.
So one of the pervading theories is that these were then used for knitting and perhaps to knit gloves. So to test this theory, someone has actually printed out a 3D scan of one of these and used it to knit a 5-fingered glove.
I really like the idea that these were for knitting gloves. It feels like the sort of thing that, smart archaeologists were scratching their heads over, chatting to astronomers and mathematicians for decades. But you just show it to someone who knows how to knit and they go, oh, it's obviously for making gloves.
But not everyone is convinced.
I'm not saying that it's not possible that it was used as a knitting device, but gloves are kind of commodity item. There are pre-existing instruments for weaving. The idea that it was used generally to knit a pair of gloves, it doesn't fit with how expensive these objects were to make and produce.
The problem is that nearly every dodecahedron is made of bronze, and bronze doesn't come cheap.
It's made out of the same materials that money is made out of.
The Roman technique for casting hollow bronze items is still used today. It's time-consuming and difficult.
You start off with a clay core. You coat this with wax. In the wax, you carve the intricate details, whatever shapes you want to make out of bronze.
You then cover the whole thing again in clay and bake it. The wax melts out.
So once you've done that, you've got a mold that has got the negative space of what you want to make out of bronze. Then you get your bronze, you melt it up to over 1,000 degrees, so it's nice and runny, it's like red hot metal now, and you pour it into the mold. It spits and it sparks, and then you wait for that to cool down.
This technique is far too expensive for everyday objects.
It doesn't, from a financial, economic point or from a trade point, make a lot of sense to take all the time and effort to make one of these incredibly intricate, beautiful objects for something that is really an everyday use item.
So what could justify the expense and effort that goes into making one of these bizarre things? After centuries of mystery, is there finally an answer? This Roman dodecahedron has baffled archaeologists for centuries and has led to a series of competing theories, each of which has as many flaws as answers. Now there is an idea that seems to fit perfectly.
One thing that is incredible about Rome is wherever you go in Northern Europe and actually across most of the Roman Empire, and you look at a Roman military camp and the way that it is laid out, it is very similar across the Roman Empire. They had an exact plan, and to put out those exact plans, they needed to have a means of taking basic measurements. How do you plan a road? How do you set out your milestones?
What marked the Roman Empire for me is that they measured distances, and not only measured them, but marked them out. They had milestones along their routes to record those distances, and they were accurate.
The dodecahedrons might be one of the secrets to this accuracy. It's all to do with the different sizes of the opposing holes.
If you look through it, because the holes are different sizes, there's a certain distance away at which the circles will appear to be the same size. And and that's always going to be at the same fixed distance away from your eyes.
All you need then is an object of a known size, preferably one that can be carried high up off the ground.
So, for example, you might get a Roman centurion carrying his standard. Then he could march off into the distance, place that standard down, and when that standard is exactly the same size as your two circles, you know that he is a certain distance away.
This theory also explains why all the holes are different sizes.
So just by rotating it, you could measure a variety of different distances.
And if you're holding it, you need to be able to manipulate it. It explains the nodules, it explains the different size holes. It would even be a way of explaining the drawings outside of the holes that are used to kind of line them up. And it's also something that functionally fits with the needs of the Roman army.
And the most essential need of all for the Roman army is winning wars.
They had to know when people were in range, not only of things like arrows, but they also had catapults. And it's not just about having this technology, it's about knowing when exactly is the right time to employ it. So this sort of thing would have great functionality in setting out roads, in setting out base camps, but also in terms of actual fighting, in terms of knowing when the enemy was in range, knowing when to fire their catapults.
So, is that case closed? Is it definitely a measuring device rather than a dice, or a glove-making tool, or a candle holder? It certainly sounds convincing. But the truth is, unless we find a written account or fresh archaeological evidence, we may never know for sure. But it's fun guessing. In 1952, hidden in a cave in Israel, archaeologists find some of the most controversial and baffling objects ever uncovered. Ancient strips of rolled up metal. The Copper Scrolls. There's nothing like them in the world. They're 12 inches long and 2 inches wide, corroded and brittle. But stamped into them are traces of an ancient text that has sparked a billion-dollar treasure hunt and a passionate argument that is still raging today.
Is it a treasure map? Isn't it a treasure map?
Now, new research may finally hold answers to one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of the 20th century. Who made these one-of-a-kind scrolls? Where do they come from? Is there really hidden treasure in the desert? Or is it just the dream of an enthusiastic archaeologist? What are the Copper Scrolls? (1947), the northwest bank of the Dead Sea.
A young goat herd was scrabbling around the rocky wilderness near the village of Qumran, about 15 miles east of Jerusalem. He entered a cave and discovered some jars that seemed to have broken pieces of parchment and papyrus in them.
These 2,000-year-old documents are some of the most important archaeological finds of modern times. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Their discovery is a game-changer for archaeologists. They include some of the oldest known fragments of the Hebrew Bible.
When scholars found these well-preserved scrolls, they were really thrilled. They had now some of the earliest biblical sources, as well as community sources that would have described the region, the kinds of practices that were going on during this time of really tumultuous Jewish history.
For biblical archaeologists, this was the find of a lifetime, of a century, perhaps of a millennium.
This gives us back a sense, effectively, of a period not far away from when the Bible or parts of the Bible were written. So this allowed scholars to really have a connection to a period when a lot of the religious works and religious communities that arose to create these works were developing.
Just 5 years later, a team of archaeologists are examining a nearby cave when they discover the Copper Scrolls. And it's immediately obvious to them that these are something totally different.
One of the most unusual things about the Copper Scroll is in its name, that it's a scroll, but something that isn't made from parchment, that is made from copper, material that's far more valuable and also difficult to inscribe. So this is something that distinguishes it as probably an important document, possibly a sacred one.
What could be so important that it justifies the effort of writing it on copper? A few words visible on the outer layer of the tightly rolled scrolls catch the expert's eyes. Those words include digging, cubits, a measure of size, and gold. Some archaeologists jump to the very obvious conclusion.
We say not to judge a book by its cover, but this is every archaeologist's dream. I've found a treasure map.
The only way to be certain the copper scrolls are a treasure map is to unroll them. But that is very risky.
The problem with copper is that if you leave it lying around for thousands of years, it oxidizes. And this oxidation makes it very brittle. The copper is extremely thin, so if you were going to try and unroll it, what would happen is the brittle copper would basically just snap.
But one expert doesn't give up.
In 1955, John Allegro, a British archaeologist, convinces the authorities in Jerusalem to allow him to cut open the scroll so that it can be translated properly.
The problem is, no machine capable of such specialized and precise work exists. So Allegro asks Professor Wright Baker at Manchester University to invent one. On the 1st of October, 1955, using a machine bolted together from a modified circular saw and a dentist's suction brush, Wright Baker begins to cut open the two priceless 2,000-year-old scrolls. One slip could be catastrophic. Over the next 3.5 months, Wright Baker's machine breaks the scrolls down into 23 segments. For the first time in 2,000 years, their secrets are revealed. So, is it a treasure map? The references to hidden gold visible on the outside turn out to be the tip of the iceberg.
When they begin to put the scroll together and translate the different parts, they realize it's not really just a treasure map. Rather, it sounds like a series of treasure maps.
What was discovered is that, in fact, they were all originally part of one single contiguous scroll, 8 feet long. This scroll had 64 individual entries for buried hoards of items, ranging from coinage to valuable metal items to various ritual holy objects.
The sheer amount of wealth that is represented in the document was unimaginable.
By the time they did the complete tally, it was something like 200 tons of gold and silver, something worth billions of dollars today. So a really mind-boggling amount had been buried in the deserts.
But something doesn't add up. That amount of wealth just seems too large. How can anyone 2,000 years ago gather together such an obscene amount of wealth or keep it secret? So, is there a billion-dollar fortune buried in the desert? Some archaeologists believe that these unique copper scrolls are the key to a hidden fortune buried somewhere in the vast Judean desert. But others struggle to accept this interpretation.
The problem is that scholarship also connected this list to the Essene community, who were a relatively austere, mystic sect at the edge of the Jewish world.
They're kind of poor people out in the desert dedicated to religious life. Yet the amount of gold and silver works out to be billions of dollars worth of gold and silver. So you're looking at these guys who look like basically pauper monks, but yet they have the wealth of Elon Musk or something like that. So it's not something you would expect. The
treasure story splits the academic world in two. John Allegro, the British archaeologist who sliced the scrolls open, is convinced the treasure is real. The opposing camp is led by one of the team that discovered the copper scrolls, biblical scholar and Catholic priest Yusuf Milik.
Yusuf Milik begins to look at this, and he does the calculations and numbers, and he realizes these numbers are far too much. There's something wrong here.
Milik doesn't just think that this was too much wealth for the Essenes. The numbers are so vast, he's convinced it's too much treasure for the whole of the Qumran region 2,000 years ago. John Allegro accepts that the initial estimates may be too high, but he has an explanation for that. It's a miscalculation.
The unit used in the text is talent, which can vary over time, and sometimes it has different meanings in different communities.
So which weight of talent are we looking at? If we are looking at a relatively lighter weight, then the value of these hoards could be significantly altered.
So it's possible that the calculation used to determine the amount of modern-day tons from a talent is incorrect. Potentially, the translation of the unit or the conversion of the unit was quite different. The community may have used a very different standard, effectively, for a talent, and so the amounts may have been far less.
Allegro argues that valuing the treasure in the millions rather than billions makes it historically credible. But that still doesn't answer one crucial question. Where does all this wealth come from in the first place? "15 miles from Qumran is Jerusalem's Wailing Wall, a sacred site of Jewish prayer and pilgrimage. It's the last remaining relic of a mighty structure known as the Herodian Second Jewish Temple.
The Second Temple was the place of worship for Jews. And what I mean "the" is that it was practically the only place of worship, and it would have had all the treasures and gold of all really mainline Jewish believers. So it would have been a very wealthy place.
Allegro believes this could explain the treasure.
John Allegro's argument was based upon the notion that these were the treasures of the Second Temple, stashed away for safekeeping during the time of the Jewish Civil War. This is where coin hoards come from, things that are put away, hopefully to be reclaimed in better days.
Milik counters that the treasure never exists in the first place and believes Allegro is misinterpreting the scrolls. To resolve this, they need a complete translation of the text. Officially, this is Milik's job, but to Allegro's frustration, Milik delays publishing his translation, with good reason.
If he says that it's fake, then he could be accused of a cover-up. If he says it's real, then there would be a descent of treasure hunters into the region trying to find these lost gold and other items. So, naturally, he delayed and procrastinated as long as possible. So, John Allegro goes ahead and publishes the list and courts media attention. The result is a great deal of recrimination and bitterness between the two scholars.
In 1962, to prove his theory, Allegro leads an expedition in search of the lost treasure.
The search for lost treasures is a phenomenon which has beckoned to humanity over the centuries and leads many a person to ruin.
Allegro doesn't find even a single nugget of gold. And despite decades of searching by treasure hunters, these incredible riches remain elusive. So, is it simply a fable? Now, new research may finally answer the secrets of the Copper Scrolls. And it's a total shock. New research now suggests a radical alternative explanation for the 2,000-year-old Copper Scrolls.
In 2015, a new theory emerged. Could the Copper Scroll have been merely an accountability list of items which had been donated to the temple over time and never actually all existed at any one given moment?
There are other Jewish ancient Hebrew texts that effectively talk about a made-up version of a treasure that didn't actually exist, but rather a kind of idealized number or value of a treasure that could have existed in the past.
This idea may be connected to the ancient Greeks. This is the Lindos Chronicle, an inventory of items in a temple to Athena, written 200 years before the Copper Scrolls.
Towards the start of the text, they actually say all these things that we've been cataloging weren't actually there.
They may have existed at one point, but the idea was that I would give these items to Athena, the goddess of Athens, as a supplication, as a dedication to her, even if I don't actually have those items, to show the dedication that you would have to her. So it's a way to show how much you love the god, effectively.
And there's a connection between lists like this and the enigmatic Copper Scrolls. The scroll is written in ancient Hebrew, but a closer look reveals Greek letters at the end of some of the entries. Greek inventories use similar notations, known as letter labels. It's a simple cataloging system, like numbering an index card. Is that what the Greek letters on the Copper Scrolls mean?
So how do you present it to your god? You have to organize it in some way. And so using Greek letters might be the way that this was done.
So like the Lindos Chronicle, the scroll could be a record of wealth for display in the temple, which may explain why it's made of metal.
Why was it in copper? Perhaps it was a matter of display. Perhaps this was, rather than a scroll, more of a plaque detailing on the wall of the temple all of the great items, all of the treasure which had been bestowed upon it over the years.
There's just one problem. Unlike the Lindos Chronicle, the Copper Scrolls identify locations for the treasure. Whether all this wealth is real or historic, why would they advertise this for any treasure hunters to see? The answer may lie in the final lines of the scroll.
Ironically, the last entry on the final sheet of the scroll is a specification about where you can find the list. Probably another Copper Scroll, which can decode the locations for the items in the larger list. So effectively, not only are the treasures missing, but the very means to locate them remains missing as well.
But as long as the potential for real treasure exists, treasure hunters will keep coming back to Qumran to seek their fortune. Whitby, in the north of England. Tucked away in the local museum is a replica of one of the strangest and most bizarre inventions in history. Standing over 3 feet tall, it looks like a model fairground carousel, but it's not. This is a Victorian cutting-edge scientific instrument. It's an intricate contraption of polished mahogany, glass, silver, and brass, and it's designed to change the world.
There has never been anything like it, before or since.
This is the Tempest Prognosticator, built to crack one of the greatest and most challenging problems of the Victorian age: the weather, using the power of leeches. 12 tiny leeches living in jars of water that are trained to ring a bell.
In the presence of extreme weather, the leeches would rise up and kind of signal that inclement weather was coming due.
150 years ago, this is a serious idea. People treat it seriously. Who comes up with this bizarre device? How's it supposed to work? And why does anyone believe a leech can tell them it's going to rain? The Tempest Prognosticator is an invention designed to predict bad weather using the power of leeches. It sounds crazy now, but in the Victorian era, anything seems possible.
Mad ideas didn't seem so mad.
By the 1850s, Victorians are making huge strides in technology and science. New inventions like rubber tires, photography, and bicycles are revolutionizing the way people live, work, and travel.
That sort of early and mid-era is a time of enormous innovation, of enormous social and physical and industrial and economic change. Things are happening so fast, it would take your breath away.
Business and trade are booming, and that's where the weather comes in.
Increasingly, as trade became more important, as there was more traffic on the seas, it became ever more important to be able to predict storms and so forth.
There is more to be lost when you've got huge fleets at sea than there was when it was just a few boats inshore. As the world became more connected and trade grew, weather had more of an impact.
Unfortunately, weather forecasting is stuck in the Dark Ages.
There have always been all these sort of folklore signs of the weather. Things like red sky at night, shepherd's delight, red sky morning, shepherd's warning.
But folklore doesn't sit comfortably with the new Victorian age of science. From electricity to magnetism to evolution, nature is giving up its secrets.
One after another, all sorts of mysteries are being cracked.
Could reliably predicting the weather be science's next great conquest?
By the Victorian times, it began to look possible to bring weather within the sort of remit of things that scientists could measure and understand and predict. This was a science really at its birth, in its very early stages, and no one was really sure what would work and what wouldn't.
Enter gentleman scientist George Merriweather.
Merriweather was a doctor of Whitby, and it seems he had all kinds of side interests. He was the curator of the local museum.
Another of his side interests is invention. In 1850, he produces his most famous and groundbreaking creation, the leech-powered Tempest Prognosticator. The core of his invention is a glass bottle containing a few inches of water and a leech. Hidden away at the top of each bottle is a system of levers and chains connected to a bell.
There was a little mechanism made from very fine bone that would be triggered by the leech coming past and that would ring a bell.
Of course, there's always a risk that one leech might misbehave, but Merriweather has a plan for that. His machine uses 12 of them.
As opposed to relying on just one leech and its wisdom on the weather report, there was actually a ring of these jars so that you could take more of a majority vote on the activities of the leeches.
The more bells that rang, then the stronger your prediction was.
It all sounds terribly rational, except for one thing. Why does Merriweather believe leeches can predict the weather? Animals often appear in the folklore of weather prediction.
There's a long history of looking at animal behavior to try to anticipate changes in the weather.
Cows lying down in fields is supposed to be an indicator that rain is on its way. There are many of these across all cultures all over the world.
In Germany, frogs are the go-to weather predictors.
Every German thinks that you can predict the weather by putting a frog in a jar with a little ladder in it, mostly made of wood, and then depending on where the frog sits, you know if it's going to rain or if it's going to be sunny.
Merriweather goes for leeches, an animal that holds a unique fascination to Victorians. He claims that leeches can sense a change in the weather and will rise up towards the surface of water when rain is coming.
The leech looks like a really primitive thing, just a kind of slug, but actually it's an amazingly sophisticated creature.
They are worms. They are not slugs or snails. They're beautifully colored. They can have an orange, green color pattern.
But the principal attraction of leeches is their macabre dietary habits.
Leeches are very much like worm vampires.
It likes to drink blood. And in order to do that, it has two suckers. So one sticks on to the host, the other one is lined with teeth, hundreds of teeth. So they bite, and as the leech sucks blood, it gives out two chemicals. One is a kind of anesthetic, and the other one is an anticoagulant, a chemical that stops the blood from clotting so that it can continue to drink. Once it's gorged itself in this way, the leech can survive for up to a year without feeding again.
This ability to draw blood is important to Victorians because many of them believe human health depends on maintaining balance between the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood.
Most attention was given to blood because either you had too much blood or you had bad blood, and in both cases, the medical leech could help.
Medical leeches are wildly popular.
There were people whose profession was leech gathering, literally, usually women this, rolling your skirts right up and walking in the sorts of places where leeches live so that they would attach to your legs. In fact, they were so much used that we pretty much fished them out of existence.
According to Merriweather, inspiration for his prognosticator comes from a poem written by vaccine pioneer, physician, and all-round science superstar Edward Jenner.
So the poem is called Signs of Rain and includes the lines, "The leech disturbed is newly risen, quite to the summit of his prison."
And as a Victorian doctor, Merriweather is probably quite keen on leeches already. But is Merriweather right? Can leeches really be trained to predict the weather? Or is this a great Victorian scam? In 1850, George Merriweather invents a machine that he claims can predict the weather and change the world using the power of leeches. But is this a giant leap in weather forecasting or a con to steal from the gullible? In the end, it all comes down to one question. Can a leech really predict the weather? Merriweather claims that leeches rise up when rain is coming. And that might not be as crazy as it sounds, because bad weather is usually associated with a drop in air pressure.
One possible reason why leeches may detect air pressure in their surroundings is that they relate to the oxygen because they need to breathe inside of the water.
Leeches get oxygen directly through their skin from the water surrounding them.
But they're very, very sensitive to the concentration of oxygen in the water, and that will change if there's a change in atmospheric pressure.
When air pressure drops, there's less oxygen in the water, so the leeches rise closer to the surface, where oxygen levels are higher.
It's for them just a matter of survival to get into an area where there's enough oxygen, or to sense if they have enough oxygen already, and then they can dive deeper.
So that was the kind of mechanical principle behind the device.
It seems Merriweather may be onto something.
The idea of Dr. Merriweather was not completely crazy at all. It was a very nice experiment, and maybe there's some truth in it.
But if his tempest prognosticator actually works, why don't we see leech barometers everywhere? What goes wrong with his brilliant plan? Well, it certainly isn't a lack of self-belief.
He gave a lovely talk to the Whitby Literary and Philosophical Society, went on for 3 hours apparently, about how successful it had been, during which he compared himself to Galileo.
But is the prognosticator really that good?
The London Illustrated News, for example, carried a story about his successful prediction of a major storm 51.5 hours before it happened. It's a fairly generous margin of error, isn't it?
In 1851, Merriweather takes his revolutionary invention to the prestigious Great Exhibition in London.
All the great scientists and inventors and manufacturers were present. It was the sensation of the age. And there he was with his leeches in the middle of it. That is just the most extraordinary piece of publicity.
Unfortunately, Merriweather doesn't need public admiration to succeed. He needs government funding.
He said that the whole of the government should install them all the way up and down the coast for the benefit of sailors and merchantmen right across the country.
But unlike the leeches, the government doesn't bite.
The prognosticator didn't take off, and it's probably no surprise that it didn't. It would have been, for one thing, an expensive thing to produce and to maintain. Leeches would keep dying. It wouldn't have been a terribly reliable instrument. Had it come 100 years earlier, it would have been perfectly in keeping with the ideas of the time. But actually, it came at a time when an instrument like this was starting to look like a device from another era. By the early to mid 19th century, scientific instruments weren't meant to look like, an aquarium with little swimming creatures in it.
Stuck between a superstitious past and a scientific future, Merriweather's Tempest prognosticator is simply mowed down by better inventions.
Oddly, it's the telegraph that makes a big difference, because you can suddenly get very, very quick results from weather stations posted all the way around, so you can start mapping what the conditions are in one place or other. And with those maps, you can start to make more informed predictions rather than just relying on your leeches.
All that remains today of Merriweather's radical invention is a replica that sits in the museum where he was once curator, albeit lacking its blood-sucking stars.